He stood before the judge, hands trembling, eyes filled with something between fear and hope. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. No one expected what came next. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said four words that froze the entire room. "You're my mom." The judge's face went pale. Gasps filled the air. How was this even possible? And why had no one seen it coming? This wasn't just a case. It was a buried truth about race, fate, and a past no one could escape. Jamal had spent his whole life bouncing between foster homes, never knowing where he truly belonged. At 16, he was used to disappointment, but today was different. Today, he stood in a courtroom, staring at the judge who would decide his future. His social worker had told him this was just another routine hearing, a formality before moving to yet another home. But something felt off. The way the judge kept looking at him, the way the attorneys whispered among themselves. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than he was being told. And he was right, because in just moments, the truth would come crashing down, changing everything he thought he knew about his life. Jamal sat stiffly in the courtroom, his hands gripping the wooden bench beneath him. The judge kept flipping through pages of his case file, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Then she sighed and looked up. "Jamal, do you know why you're here today?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. He swallowed hard. "They said it's just a placement hearing," he muttered. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not exactly." A murmur spread through the room. Jamal shifted uncomfortably as his social worker refused to meet his gaze. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Then the judge took a deep breath. "There's something you need to know about your past." The room fell eerily silent. Jamal's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Your birth mother." The judge hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "She didn't abandon you." Jamal's chest tightened. That couldn't be true. He had been in the system since he was a baby. The only thing he had ever been told was that his mother gave him up and never looked back. "She was told you didn't survive." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jamal's hands started shaking. "What?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. The judge glanced at the attorneys, then back at him. "Your mother is alive." Another pause, a deep breath. "And Jamal, I am your mother." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The air was sucked from the room. For a second, Jamal thought he had misheard her. He stared at the judge, his vision swimming, his breath shallow. "No," he shook his head. "That's not possible." His mind raced, piecing together fragments of a life he had never known. If this was true, if the woman in front of him was really his mother, then why had she never come for him? Why had he spent his whole life in the system alone? He looked at her, searching for answers, but all he saw was pain in her eyes. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the revelation crushing. And then, before Jamal could process the truth, the real nightmare began. Jamal's breath came in short, uneven gasps. The judge, his mother, was still speaking, but the words blurred together, lost in the roaring in his ears. How could this be real? Then the opposing attorney stood. His voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we need to address the real issue here." Jamal barely had time to process before the man continued. "The records show that this boy was declared deceased at birth. Yet somehow he ended up in the foster system. Someone signed off on that paperwork. Someone wanted him gone." The tension in the room thickened. A buried truth was clawing its way to the surface. Jamal's mother, Judge Reynolds, closed her eyes as if bracing herself. "I was told my baby didn't make it." Her voice wavered, but she steadied it. "I searched. I demanded answers. But when a black woman in the system questions authority, she gets silence." The attorney shook his head. "Silence, or worse." Jamal felt the weight of those words. The truth settled in his chest like a heavy stone. His entire life, years of bouncing between homes, the loneliness, the questions, hadn't been an accident. It had been stolen. Who did this? Jamal's voice was raw. His mother turned to him, her eyes glistening. Someone who believed you didn't deserve a place in this world. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. And then, boom! The doors burst open. A bailiff rushed in, whispering urgently in the judge's ear. Her face paled. Jamal, she said, her voice shaking. The people who did this, they're here. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears as uniformed officers flooded the courtroom. For a moment, time felt frozen. Then whispers turned to gasps as the truth unraveled. A network of corruption, buried for years, had come to light. The system had stolen him, erased him, and left him to fend for himself. Judge Reynolds, his mother, stood firm, her voice no longer trembling. This ends today. The investigation that followed shook the foundations of the system. Names were exposed, careers ended, and policies that had quietly destroyed families for years were finally questioned. But for Jamal, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming the life he had been denied. Yet no amount of justice could give him back the childhood he lost. The years of loneliness, the nights wondering why no one wanted him. Those scars wouldn't fade overnight. As cameras flashed outside the courthouse, reporters asked the same question over and over. How could this happen? But deep down, Jamal already knew. It happened because stories like his weren't rare. It happened because the system was never built to protect kids like him. And the real question wasn't how this happened. It was how many more were still lost, waiting for the truth to find them.